The Ides of March is a day steeped in a history of bloodshed and slaughter. To the ancient Romans, this day held a deeper significance rooted in religious ritual and sacrifice. It was considered a highly sacred day, intricately linked to the agricultural origins of Roman culture and the cyclical rhythms of the lunar calendar, particularly associated with fertility, harvest, and planting rituals. On the Ides, which fell on the 13th of most months, and the 15th of March, May, July, and October, coinciding likely with the full moon, priests would lead the sacrificial offering of a sheep, known as the ovis idulus, to the altar. The purpose of this ritual, to sacrifice the eyed sheep, was to please and appease Jupiter, the chief god of the Roman pantheon, and maintain the delicate balance between the divine and mortal realms by the offering of blood. This sacrifice was believed to be essential for preserving harmony and the status quo, propitiating the god and expiating the sins of the people. In this light, then, we might interpret the infamous Ides of 44 BC as a sacrificial act, the Ides Martii of 44, or the Ides of March of 44 BC. Akin to the offerings made in ancient religious rituals. Caesar's murder, then, could be seen as a sacrifice upon the altar of the Republic, representing an idealistic notion of restoring balance and harmony. Additionally, the event bears similarities to Greek cleansing or scapegoating rituals, where the expulsion of a certain individual served as a means of cleansing collective corruption. Regardless, the Ides of March serves as a poignant reminder of the complex interplay between religion, politics, and human nature in ancient Rome and perhaps today. We have a number of sources for Caesar's assassination. Suetonius, a Roman writer who had access to the imperial archives and may have consulted eyewitness accounts, and two later Greek sources, Nicolaus of Damascus and Plutarch, writing about 150 years after the event. Their accounts, their narratives agree with each other, and we know a great deal about the actual last moments of Caesar's life. When we consider that a generation or two ago, John F. Kennedy was shot on video, and the controversy and the uncertainties that remain about that, it's quite remarkable that we can construct such a detailed and precise narrative of Caesar's assassination. It's important to note that the history of Rome is long steeped in violence. Its founder, Romulus, shown here in Rubens' painting, of course, as an abandoned waif. He and his brother Remus were cast on the river Tiber. Romulus would grow up and murder his brother, establishing Rome as a kingdom and baptizing it in the blood of internecine fraternal strife. And the Roman monarchy would continue for about 250 years, until again another violent act brought an end to the monarchy and established the Republic. When a certain Lucius Junius Brutus, a name of course associated with the Ides of March, would lead a revolt of aristocrats against the last king of Rome, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the arrogant, the haughty one. Brutus and a group of aristocrats drove the last king, Tarquin, from the city and abolished the very institution of monarchy itself. As we see here, Livy records the sacred oath that those tyrannicides took never to permit a king to rule at Rome again. And the Latin word rex, the word for king, would carry the kind of connotations to the Romans that words like Führer or Duce would to a modern ear. Very similar then, and deliberately so, the framers of the Constitution of the United States took the Roman Republic as its inspiration. They too, notably throwing off the yoke of a king. But by the time of Caesar's mid-career, the year 60 BC, the Roman Republic, 450 years old at that point, was collapsing under, ironically, the weight of its own success. Following the Roman victories in the Punic Wars over Carthage, Rome had begun to disintegrate, descend into civil chaos. The influx of wealth and the distribution of wealth and land amongst a small fraction of the upper class population had created great social tensions in Rome. And for about 80 years before 60 BC, Rome was in a simmering state of on and off low-grade civil war. And into the chaos then in 60 BC, this group of three ambitious, ruthless politicians, whom we refer to from an historical perspective as the First Triumvirate, but at the time it was an unofficial secret cabal made up of Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey. The historian Appian referred to them as the Tricaranus, the three-headed beast. These three men then, in 60 BC, conspired together to seize control of the floundering republic. Through use of wealth, political influence, and nobility of name, they conspired together to seize control of the powerful offices of government. In the center is Marcus Licinius Crassus, famous for his wealth, a ruthless businessman who created a firefighting force in ancient Rome and then would light houses on fire and then negotiate for the sale of the house, had grown incredibly wealthy during this period of political turmoil. You may know of Crassus. He's the Roman general who brought the revolt of Spartacus, the Thracian gladiator, who fought the Romans then from 73 to 71 BC. It was Crassus who brought this revolt to an end. And you get a sense of his personality. Upon defeating Spartacus and his army of gladiators and slaves, Crassus crucified 6,000 of Spartacus's supporters along 200 kilometers of the Appian Way. 6,000 rebels crucified along 200 kilometers of road. And Crassus and Caesar had a pre-existing relationship. Crassus was his senior by about 15 years. Caesar born in 100 BC, Crassus about 115. And Crassus had used his wealth to help the early career of Caesar. Caesar came from an incredibly noble family, the Julii clan. But in the last number of generations, they'd come to very little. And Crassus had used his considerable ill-gotten wealth to help and nurture the early career of Caesar. We have evidence from this in Suetonius's biography of Julius Caesar. Suetonius notes that in 63 BC, Caesar declared he would run for the position of Pontifex Maximus, the office of Pope, effectively, an incredibly powerful position in Roman politics. The Romans were deeply, deeply religious people. Caesar ran for this office in 63 BC, and here in this quotation from Suetonius, you can see the influence of the wealth of Crassus. He ran for the position of Pontifex Maximus, winning, employing extensive bribery tactics to bolster his campaign, and undoubtedly that money came from Crassus. So they had a pre-existing relationship. The third member of the triumvirate, or the Tricaranus, was Pompey. Pompey the Great, as he was known. Crassus had the wealth. He funded the triumvirate. And Pompey brought a kind of military legitimacy to the group. He was the most celebrated soldier of his day. He was MacArthur-esque in sort of his stature. He was known as Pompey the Great. He participated in all the wars of the late Republic, the Sertorian Wars, Servile Wars, Mithridatic Wars. He gained great fame for ridding pirates from the Mediterranean. And he was known as Aduluscanes Carnifex, the young butcher. Again, evidence of his sort of ruthless attitude. To connect and to bind the triumvirate together, as we've seen, Crassus and Caesar had a pre-existing relationship. In order to bring Pompey into the group, they employed a dynastic marriage. Caesar's daughter, Julia, in 59 BC, was engaged at the moment to be married to another Roman aristocrat, whose name is disputed in the sources. At any rate, Caesar broke off his daughter's engagement and married her to his political partner, Pompey. thus cementing the triumvirate together. The pre-existing relationship of Crassus and Caesar, making those two strong allies, and by marriage now, Pompey was connected to the rest of the triumvirate. One of the first acts then was to use their wealth and influence to get Caesar elected to the office of consul. When the kings were abolished in 509, the office of king was replaced by 2 consuls. They were elected annually, and they held between the two the previous executive power of the king. So Caesar, then with the support of his fellow triumvirs, was elected consul in 59. This is rather an important portrait, actually. It's one of 2 that we believe was made during Caesar's lifetime. So he was elected to the highest office of the Republic, consulship in 59 BC, and the following year then, following his consulship, he engaged upon his great and best-known military achievement, the Gallic Wars, basically the invasion of France and Belgium, which he wrote about in the Commentarii di Bello Gallico. Caesar was a great self-promoter, and he wrote about then his 8-year conquest of effectively France, Germany, and Switzerland, writing about himself in the third person, so that people would believe it was a neutral account of his greatness. And one of Caesar's outstanding qualities then was his ability at theatrical self-promotion and self-interest. So following this consulship then, he assembled an army and invaded across the Alps and on a personal war of conquest. Interestingly, during that period, he led the first Roman incursion across the Rhine, an 18-day lightning campaign in which he bridged the Rhine and led the first Roman armies into the land of the German tribes. He also, on 2 occasions, then invaded Britain. Of course, as we know, Britain would not be Romanized until about 100 years later under the reign of the Emperor Claudius. And he wrote about it, of course, in his Gallic Wars. The image here records the landing in 55, in which the initial wave of Roman troops then were being repelled at the beaches, and an unnamed but famous centurion, sort of a senior non-commissioned officer in his legions, grabbed the royal standard, leapt off the landing craft, and waded ashore, encouraging then his troops to follow him. The turning point then in the Gallic Wars was in the year 52, at the Battle of Alesia, or Alesia probably, noted for Caesar's tactical brilliance. He besieged the city of Alesia, and he surrounded it in a wall and laid siege to this important center in the center of Gaul. A huge relief army was sent to break the siege. Caesar built a second wall, then walling himself in, both besieging and repelling a siege. And this brought then the final and most humiliating defeat of Vercingetorix, who had then taken on sort of the leadership of the Gallic armies. At the end of the siege, Vercingetorix then surrendered to Caesar. This image based on Plutarch's account, in which he rode into Caesar's camp, dismounted from his horse, stripped himself naked, and lay prostrate on the ground, surrendering himself and thus all Gaul to Caesar's control. This is historically of great significance. It established about 500 years of Roman control of France. But it also revealed something. It revealed the rising tensions in Roman politics. And sometimes in history, I think we lose appreciation for the role that personalities play. Perhaps the distance of 2,000 years, right, can occlude the role of the individual human personalities at work. If we read Velleius Paterculus, we can see that Caesar's victories are proving problematic and revealing some of the cracks within Roman politics. Caesar gets too popular, you might argue. Throughout this period, spanning the years immediately following, and those previously mentioned, Gaius Caesar achieved remarkable military success. Now, from Pompey's perspective, this was problematic. Pompey was the soldier in the triumvirate. That was his domain. That's how he distinguished himself as a member of the triumvirate. And here we have Caesar establishing his own military credentials. His campaigns resulted in the deaths of over 400,000 enemy soldiers. He certainly did stack them up. He undertook 2 expeditions into Britain, and all 9 of his campaigns displayed extraordinary skill and valor. His actions at Alesia were particularly remarkable, and perhaps Caesar gets too popular by far too much. His actions were particularly remarkable to the extent that they seemed beyond the capabilities of an ordinary mortal and more fitting for a deity to accomplish. His success across the Alps was taking the previously united triumvirate and creating gaps between the members. And this group that had been based upon the equality of the members, one having military reputation, the other wealth, Caesar bringing the nobility of his association to the Julii clan, was now less a triumvirate, and the other 2 members were uncomfortable living in the shadows of Caesar. So his great success started to drive the personal jealousies and rivalries between these 3 very powerful, ambitious men. And then fate intervened. Julia, Caesar's daughter, and had been married to Pompey in 59 to help cement the 2 men together by dynastic marriage. She died in 54. About the 4th year of Caesar's stay in Gaul occurred the death of Julia, the wife of Pompey, the one tie which bound together Pompey and Caesar in a coalition, which, Paterculus notes, had been held together with difficulty even during her lifetime. And as though fortune were bent upon breaking all the bonds between the 2 men, destined for so great a conflict, the son that she delivered, although dying in childbirth herself, died a short time afterwards. So we see that the bond that had held Pompey and Caesar together was now gone. And then in 53, the next year, an even greater threat occurred to the triumvirate: the death of Crassus himself. Marcus Licinius Crassus died in 53. He died at the Battle of Carrhae. Where? Here, the eastern edge of the Roman Empire. He died fighting against the Parthians. Parthia was a rump kingdom of Alexander's old empire that had been established in the mid-3rd century by Arsaces I. So campaigning here in Parthia, Crassus was killed. He was captured by the Parthians, and his death becomes something of a theatrical spectacle. The Parthians were aware of his great love of wealth, so they executed him in a way fitting his well-known greed. They poured molten gold down his throat, sort of a theatrical and appropriate end to a man who so loved wealth. And with Crassus gone, the previously stable molecule of the triumvirate then was dangerously unbalanced. And with Caesar and Pompey remaining, we see that they began to exist along a dangerous fault line in Roman politics. The populares and the optimates. It's wrong to think of these 2 groups in the strictest sense as political parties. Now, they weren't organized as political parties were today, but there were 2 groups within the Roman Republic. The populares, those who relied upon their power derived from the people. Demagogues, if you will. And Caesar derived much of his support then from the will of the masses. Contrast this with the optimates, the aristocrats. And this was the basis of Pompey's power group. So Caesar then played to the urge of the people. And Pompey, of course, then worked on behalf then of maintaining aristocratic privilege. So there was a great uneasy tension between these 2 men. And with the absence of Crassus, there seemed to be only one man between any of these and complete control of Rome. And from across the Alps in Gaul, Caesar began exerting a strong effect. His shadow loomed over Roman politics. Plutarch records that during this time, Caesar intensified his involvement in public affairs with renewed energy. He was meddling from across the Alps. He ceased to keep himself distant, not physically, but by influence from Italy. Instead, frequently dispatching his soldiers to the city to participate in elections. Right? Caesar would send his troops to go stand at the polling booths, encouraging people to vote for the candidates that supported him. A not unknown strategy today. Rumors circulated that even Caesar's centurions, upon learning that the Senate was unwilling to grant him an extension of his term, right? Caesar had requested an extension of his military rule over Gaul, and he particularly wanted a second consulship. And when his centurions, his sergeants, if you will, upon learning that the Senate was unwilling to grant him an extension, expressed their loyalty by suggesting that force would achieve his aims. So his retired veterans then were threatening the Roman Senate. Interfere with Caesar's ambitions and you'll deal with us. This atmosphere underscored the increasing tension and polarization within Rome's political landscape, not strictly between two political parties, but between two political ideologies. And Caesar is using the threat of military force to drive politics his own way. And what he particularly wanted then was a second consulship. He'd held consul in 59, and by tradition, you could only hold a consulship after 10 years had passed. So in 49, he wanted his second consulship. Okay? In response then, the Senate and Pompey and others wanted to block his ambition. They labeled Caesar a robber and advocated for him to be declared a public enemy unless he be disarmed. Caesar's supporters reacted passionately, demanding that he be given a second consulship. There were riots in the street. The Senate was threatened. Caesar's veterans threatened military force. And then the Senate responded, protecting aristocratic privilege from the ambitions of Caesar by passing legislation called the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, a very rarely used senatorial decree, in Latin meaning the final decree of the Senate. It was the strongest, rarest expression of senatorial privilege, and had been used only on a few occasions when Rome was under dire threat. In 49, then, the Senate passed this decree, demanding that Caesar disarm himself, return to Rome, and face prosecution as a private citizen. Caesar, of course, was in Gaul. He received the message, thought what to do, and he headed south, traveling across the Alps from Gaul into Italy, where he came to a river called the Rubicon. Not a formidable geographic obstacle, but one of incredible importance nonetheless, by its symbolism. This humble, small stream, really, divided Italy from Gaul. It was the demarcation of the end of Gaul, the end of Caesar's area of military influence. He arrived at the Rubicon River on January 10th, 49 BC. And he understood the implications of crossing that river with his army. The sources tell us that he pondered, thought. Upon reaching the banks of the river, the designated boundary of his province, he paused in contemplation. He stood in silence. He knew he was standing on the verge of history, and he pondered the enormity of the step, physical and otherwise, he was about to take, engaged in an eternal dialogue about the significance of his impending decision. And we know he crossed the river. Right? He plunged in on horseback. Then, as if hurling himself, Plutarch writes, from a precipice into a vast abyss. Plutarch's a Greek, so he gets carried away every now and then, but why not? The moment's full of drama. He relinquished the guidance of reason, shrouding himself from the impending danger, and with a cry in Greek to onlookers, he uttered these words alone. In Greek, mind you. Anaryphtho kubos, let the die be cast. Right? An aleatory comment, surrendering himself to fate. But there's a double meaning there. It's quite interesting. He showed himself to be quite a literary fellow, speaking in Greek, not Latin, no less. Bit show off. That's Caesar for you. It's an aleatory remark as well, but he's also quoting a famous Athenian playwright, a certain Menander. And perhaps unknowingly foreshadowing his own fate, he quotes a playwright who's famous also for this line, hon hoi theoi phelusin, apothneske neos. The one whom the gods loves dies young. Does he foretell his own impending death? Of course, James Dean embraces this notion along the way. In Latin, Suetonius records his saying as alia jacta est, the die is cast. In simple terms, he said, F it, let's go. And of course, this idea of crossing the Rubicon is still part of the modern lexicon today. When you face a monumental decision from which there is no going back, it is crossing your Rubicon. Of course, so many newspapers in the last 2 years have liked to show their familiarity with the ancient sources by making reference, of course, to Putin's action as crossing our Rubicon. The New York Times, not surprisingly, used it for a discussion of abortion. And perhaps we might be able to reimagine this famous moment in recent politics in which a presidential candidate announced his candidacy not by crossing a river, but by taking a much misunderstood escalator ride, that perhaps the theatricality of which he understood in a way that Caesar understood at the Rubicon. So having crossed the river with his army in tow, it was a declaration of civil war against the Senate. The first town he encountered, modern Rimini. Here, if we're to believe this monument, he addressed his troops. The inscription can be translated into English. After the Rubicon had been crossed and the civil war had commenced, Gaius Caesar, the dictator, stood among his comrades in the Forum of Ariminum to address them. And who were his comrades? They were the members of the 13th Legion, the Legio Tertia Decima Gemina. Each legion had a number and a nickname and an animal with which they were associated. So the Legio Tertia Decima Gemina, the twin legion, took the lion as its motif, and it had been raised by Caesar himself in 57 BC. He'd campaigned with them for years. These were some of his most trusted veterans. This legion, the 13th Legion, an infantry assault legion, would be in active service until the 5th century AD, and had been founded by Caesar, raised by Caesar in 57. An interesting thing to note then is that the soldiers were personally loyal to their commander. They were Caesar's army, not an army of the state, not an army of Rome. He raised them, he looked after them, and they followed him across the Rubicon. They vehemently declared their resolve to uphold the honor of their commander and to seek retribution for the injustices inflicted upon them. And here we see that Caesar initiates a civil war. Upon his crossing the Rubicon, Pompey, who'd been put in charge of the army of the Republic, immediately fled to Egypt, where they were attempting to raise a larger army and prepare for to Greece. They fled immediately to Greece, preparing then for war with Caesar. The decisive battle took place almost in the first year, the Battle of Pharsalus here in northeastern Greece in 48 BC. A resounding victory for Caesar in which he demonstrated one of his chief qualities, or flaws, as his successor might see it. Caesar was noted for clementia, a word that translates itself easily out of the Latin and into English. His clemency, his mercy, his forgiveness. It was one of his defining characteristics. And a student of his, a young Octavian, might see this as his ultimate downfall. Because at the end of the battle, Caesar was noted for pardoning and embracing his former enemies, to bringing the defeated then into the embrace of his forgiveness. And at the end of Pharsalus in 48, one of the young men that Caesar forgave and pardoned was a young man named Marcus Junius Brutus. He was born in 85 BC, about 15 years younger than Caesar, and he claimed family descent from this Brutus. So you could see why the younger Brutus might have been inclined to resist Caesar. His family had a long association with expelling kings and upholding and establishing the republic. So by family association, he felt compelled as a matter of principle to join the resistance to Caesar. Caesar was particularly close to Brutus. Brutus was about 14, 15 years younger than he was. And there were rumors, in fact, that Caesar might have been Brutus's father. Plutarch's biography of Brutus and Suetonius's biography of Julius provide evidence for this. Brutus's mother was a certain Servilia Caeponis, a year older than Caesar. And there's evidence then that when Caesar was about 14, possibly 15 years old, he had an affair with Brutus's mother, and that he actually may have been the unacknowledged father of Brutus, perhaps explaining why he had such affection for the young boy and why at the Battle of Pharsalus he was so concerned for his safety. The majority of those captured alive by Caesar were assimilated into his legions. So perhaps there was a practical consideration for his clemency, fill out his troops. But there was certainly a personality trait at work as well. While many prominent individuals were granted immunity, among them was Brutus. And Caesar, it is reported, felt distressed that he couldn't find Brutus. He was particularly interested in the young man's well-being, but upon his safe and sound appearance, he was exceedingly pleased. Pompey, the leader of the revolt, of the senatorial army, fled from Greece to Egypt, where he expected to be greeted and treated well. Instead, he was betrayed and murdered by the young king. And it was in pursuit then of Pompey to Egypt that Caesar would have his famous encounter with Cleopatra. She, according to Plutarch, famously had herself smuggled into his tent. She had herself rolled up in a carpet, smuggled past the guards, and when the carpet was unrolled, out popped Cleopatra. Caesar was suitably impressed by her appearance, and also her vast wealth and resources, that a great affair took place. It's from his base in Egypt, of course, that he would conduct his lightning campaign against Pharnaces II of Pontus. Not too important to us, but of course it does give us his famous remark upon his victory. Plutarch writes that he wrote Elthon eidon enikesa in Greek, which in Latin becomes Vini vidi vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. So, having defeated Pompey, having of course scored this impressive victory that gave him the legendary saying Vini vidi vici, he finally decided to return to Rome, where he was expecting, rightfully, a triumph. It was traditional then for conquering generals to be allowed to march through Rome under arms with the men. A great privilege offered only to the great conquering generals. They would drive their captured war slaves before them, display all the captured loot. Right? And we see a scene from the Arch of Titus here of Titus himself conducting a victory parade. So Caesar wanted then his own triumph. His ego demanded it. But there was something unseemly and unsettling about Caesar's triumph to the Roman people. Because the triumph he was celebrating, right, it stirred great vexation and worry amongst the Roman people. When Caesar returns, he starts to alienate himself and make missteps and miscalculations that obviously provoke the affairs of the Ides of March. There was something inappropriate about his celebration. What was it? His victory was over fellow Romans. Right? His chief victory was over Pompey, and then he'd hunted down and killed his sons as well. And the Romans thought there was something grotesque about celebrating then such an illegitimate military victory. It seemed inappropriate for Caesar to boast a triumph for the afflictions suffered by his own country, finding pride in deeds that lacked justification before both gods and men accept the claim of necessity. And here we see a glimpse of his ruthless side. Remember, he defeated Vercingetorix so many years prior at the Battle of Alesia. He'd kept Vercingetorix alive this entire time so that he could be paraded in his triumph and then strangled publicly in front of the cheering crowd. So Caesar's return to Rome is characterized by missteps, excess, perhaps a kind of hubris or arrogance. And he brought with him two people that were complicating his reputation. He brought Cleopatra back from Egypt, along with the son he'd had with her, a certain Caesarion. Cleopatra was a queen, and the Romans abhorred the notion of a king. So here we see by his behavior, by his conduct, by his association with an Egyptian queen and a son named after himself with her, we could see how he'd start to rub the Roman population the wrong way. He was married at the time to a certain Calpurnia. Now, the Romans didn't expect sexual fidelity or monogamy from their kings or men in general, but they did expect a kind of respect for the Roman traditions. And by flaunting his relationship with a foreign queen, right, where Calpurnia represented Roman nobility itself, he seemed to be turning his back on very important Roman ideals. And his behavior becomes more grandiose by the day. The Senate named him father of his country, pater patriae. Now, this is not Caesar's coin, but his successor will use the term. Pater patriae, father of the country. If you turn the coin on the side here, you can see pater patriae there in the numismatic evidence. Okay? So he started to assume and accept grandiose titles. Then we almost see hints of a future deification in mind. Statues are erected of him, and statues of him wearing crowns. And we start to see Caesar now in the accounts flirting with the appearance of nobility. He's testing the waters. He starts wearing the triumphal gown that he paraded in as his daily garb, right? Dressing, if you will, as a king. Statues of him are erected wearing crowns. When one of the tribunes of the plebs, the people's representative, removes those crowns, Caesar has him prosecuted. On a number of occasions, we see Caesar publicly offered a crown. At the Lupercalia, his right-hand man, Mark Antony, at this great religious festival, which is now Valentine's Day in our calendar, incidentally, and it's the opening scene of Shakespeare's play. At the Lupercalia, Caesar is publicly offered a crown, looking at the crowd to see if people will cheer this or not. When the crowd seems hesitant, he rejects the crown publicly. But you can see he's experimenting then with the appearance of royalty. He then reforms the calendar, a notoriously problematic part of Roman life, and it explains actually one of the great mysteries of my own childhood. I could never understand why September, October, November, and December are the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th month in our calendar, where clearly December should be the 10th month. The Roman calendar started in March. There was no January or February. The first month of the Roman calendar was the month of Mars, the war god, hence December actually being the 10th month. Then if we look at this numismatic evidence here, we see this silver denarius. This numismatic evidence is important, minted in 44. We see Caesar using a title, right? There's his name, Caesar. On the other side of the coin, actually, you see his supposed ancestor, that is Venus, and she's holding the goddess Victory in her hand. So he's making allusions to his divine lineage there. His name is written around, Dict, short for dictator. The Romans had an office called the dictator. It was an emergency office. If Rome was ever under great threat, they would suspend the constitution and appoint a dictator. And they'd usually run Rome for about 10, 15 days, 20 days until the crisis was averted. So Caesar's then using, right, he's abrogating an existing office, having himself named dictator. It's part of the constitution. But then he adds this word, perpetuo, dictator for life. He's trying to find the right terminology to be king by another title. He increased alarm then by permitting himself somewhat later to be chosen dictator for life. And of course, if we think about that crown and the symbolism of the crown, we might again think of certain other theatricality in politicians. Right? And that some of these actions may be interpreted then through the lens of an ancient understanding. The straw then, the final straw, which the aristocrats could take no more from Caesar, crowning himself, dictator for life, monuments built to him, wearing the triumphal gown round the clock, was he received a group from the Senate. One day they'd voted him so many honors, and they approached him as he was sitting in the vestibule of the Temple of Venus, the remains of which are here. Now remember, this is an important stage for him. He believes his family is descended from this god. The hubris of this. The Senate's coming to give him honors, and he says, yeah, meet me in the temple of my great-grandmother, the goddess. And he's sitting in the temple when they arrive. And the Senate, this august body, comes to see him. He received them sitting down. He refused to stand to the Senate in the temple that assumed his own divine lineage. And they hated him for his haughtiness, his arrogance, and they decided that Caesar had to be stopped. There's a counter-narrative here that some of you may know. His apologists suggest that he was actually just suffering from a terrible bout of diarrhea and was afraid to stand up. Either way, whether it was misinterpreted or not, the effect was same by the Senate. They were infuriated that he would not stand when they arrived. So they decided that he wanted to assume the title king. Time was pressing. He'd announced that in spring, he himself would undertake an invasion of Parthia to complete what Crassus had failed to do. So he was going to leave in the spring of 44. He'd been away in Gaul for 8 years, growing more powerful. He'd be beyond their reach. So if they wanted to do away with him, they had to do away with him before he was in the company of his soldiers. No one was going to assassinate him surrounded by the 13th Legion. So he was off to Parthia. Something else. The report had spread in various quarters that he intended to move away, right? Travel to Parthia and conquer the Parthians. But it was written in the books of fate that the Parthians could only be conquered by a king. So one of his colleagues was going to pass a law that Caesar should be given the title. Lucius Cotta was going to propose the law that Caesar should be given, for convenience sake, the title Rex, king, so that he would have the correct title that fate demanded would succeed in the conquest of Parthia. Now, some say that this is Caesar's first revelation of his interest in kingship. But if we look much earlier in his life, when he delivered a eulogy, and who would think that a politician would use a eulogy to advance their own interests? At the funeral of his Aunt Julia, he publicly asserted his connection to the divine lineage of Venus and that his line was the natural line of kings. So in the spring, February, early March, a group of senators decided that they had to kill Caesar. 60 of them, we think, joined a conspiracy led by a certain Gaius Cassius and Marcus and Decimus Brutus. And they chose then a meeting of the Senate that was called for the very religious, auspicious day, the Ides of March, the 15th of March, in the Hall of Pompey. Pompey, as one-time rival, had created this great theater, which is a 3D model is shown here. And at the front of it, the Curia of the Theatrum Pompey was where the Senate was going to meet on the Ides of March, and they chose that as the moment to kill Caesar. They'd floated a lot of ideas, one of which was to throw him off a bridge while he was walking through the city. But they chose to kill him at the Senate. His assassins were facing a real problem. They needed to kill a very popular man in a way that passed the sense of legitimacy. They wanted to kill him in a political gesture. And they thought by killing him at the Senate, right, it would bathe the action in sort of a sense of political legitimacy. So 60 of them were conspired. They'd all sworn an oath that they'd all commit suicide if any one of them had found out. and the conspirators chose each other wisely. They were looking for men about the same age, mid-30s to 40s. They didn't want any old codgers who were probably too old and feeble to get the job done, and they didn't want any young, reckless blokes either who might get carried away. So they chose an ideological group that were opposed to Caesar, many his former friends and allies who thought he'd just gone too far. They chose then the Ides of March, the meeting of the Senate. One of the assassins, Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, brought along a group of gladiators, just in case things got out of hand. The Romans celebrated everything with gladiatorial fights, so it didn't strike anyone as unusual. Right? Thus, the presence of weapons might not spark anyone's concerns. And the gladiators there were to create sort of a ring around the event, drive away any supporters, and deal with the situation if it went sideways. On the day of the planned assassination, Caesar woke up sick. He'd been dizzy and ill, sent a message that he wasn't going to go. He was feeling ill. Many people believe he suffered from epilepsy along the way. His wife also warned him that she had a bad feeling about the day. And famously, soothsayers had warned him that the auspices for the day looked foul. So he was faced then with the advice of his wife, his own illness, and then his own physician's concerns about going. Decimus, the man who provided the gladiators, sensed trouble and went to Caesar's house. Nicholas of Damascus tells us. And he appealed to Caesar's sense of Roman masculinity. He mocked Caesar for not going to work, saying, "You're not going to listen to the superstitious omens of foolish old men. You're not going to listen to your wife, are you? You're not going to let a woman," he berated him, "tell you not go to work." So Caesar pulled on his best toga. "Bah," he said, and off he went to face his destiny. The plan was complicated and layered. The first job the assassin saw was to isolate him. The conspirators knew that he'd arrived then with his henchman Antony, a physically robust man, strong, and a great supporter of Caesar. The first thing they decided to do then was that they would isolate him from Antony. In fact, they thought long and hard about whether to kill Antony along with Caesar. In fact, many of the conspirators wanted a bloodbath. They wanted to kill all of Caesar's supporters. But it was Brutus, long associated with the family that had created the Republic, that demanded a limited strike upon Caesar. He didn't want a bloodbath. He didn't want a purge. Right? He wanted a legal removal of what he believed was an extrajudicious tyrant. Right? So he spared Antony. He refused to participate if it was going to be a purge. And against then their better judgment, they agreed with Brutus and agreed only to kill Caesar. Nevertheless, Antony had to be removed. So as they approached the Senate, as they approached where the Senate was being held, possibly one, Brutus Albinus or Gaius Trebonius, distracted Antony at the door, talking to him on the way in, saying, "Antony, I have some important business." Caesar looked and walked now alone into the Senate meeting. They feared him physically, that he might protect Caesar. And then the murder itself began to unvolve. As Caesar entered, the Senate rose in reverence. They all stood for him. I think an ironic reminder of his refusal to stand for him also gets them on their feet, where they're able to strike. Supporters of Brutus positioned themselves around the back of Caesar's chair, while others approached him under the guise of supporting a certain Cimber's plea on behalf of his exiled brother. So immediately as he sits down, they surround him, they start haranguing him. They were distracting and surrounding their victim. I'm sure he sensed something was wrong. They were too close and too urgent. As Caesar remained steadfast, they kept asking him about this piece of legislation for Cimber. Their pleas grew increasingly irritated by their persistence. Tullius Cimber resorted to a bold action. He took grip then of Caesar's toga and forcefully pulled it down, right? Restraining Caesar's arms and exposing his body. The toga is just a cloak, but it's a thick, many-folded cloak, and it would have got in the way of the assassin's daggers. Cimber put his hands on Caesar and pulled his toga down around his shoulders. Caesar was outraged. "No one can touch Caesar." Suetonius records, he says to him, "Ista quidem vis est." says, "What is this violence?" he says, "touching me?" And upon that, then, the first of the assassins struck. Casca, we know his name. He was the one who struck him first with his dagger, aiming for the neck. He missed. The sources vary, striking him in the lower neck or in the upper chest. Nor was it particularly deep, as Casca was overwhelmed with nerves. This would have been a stressful moment, right? To walk up to Caesar and stab him in the throat, right? So we can understand Casca's nervousness, a natural response at the outset of such a daring act. He stabbed him, and Caesar turned around, right? He stabbed him from just below the throat, Suetonius reports. So they attacked him with surprise. Having received the first wound from Casca, cowardly in the back, nervously stabbing him in the throat or upper chest, Caesar turned around and faced him. And this must have been an impressive moment because he reached out and grabbed Casca's knife and stared him in the face. An impressive thing when you think what he was grabbing hold of, the Roman dagger, the pugio. And old Caesar wasn't going down without a fight. He'd come without a dagger, so he took his writing pen and stabbed Casca in the arm with his stylus. Holding the dagger with one arm, he stabbed him with his fountain pen effectively in the other. At which point Casca cried out, Plutarch records in Greek, Caesar spoke to Casca in Latin. "Casca, you bastard," he said to him, "what are you doing?" And with Caesar holding his knife in one hand and having stabbed him in the arm and challenging him with this reproach, Casca yelled out in Greek, "Adelphe boete," screaming to his brother, "Help me!" His brother obeyed, and then Caesar was stabbed a second time in the side, while another delivered a striking blow across his face. Decimus Brutus followed suit, stabbing Caesar in the thigh with a particularly forceful blow, further heightening the chaos. And then Cassius Longinus, fueled by eagerness to inflict more harm, attempted another strike, but inadvertently wounded Marcus Brutus on the hand. And the frenzy persisted. As Minucius lunged at Caesar, he accidentally struck Rubrius in the thigh instead. It was mayhem. Assassins stabbing each other, slipping in the blood, utter chaos, escalating the moment into a frenzy. And of course, the assassins relied on overwhelming force and numbers. And thus the scene unfolded. The conspirators, having prepared themselves for the deed, brandished their daggers. Caesar was surrounded on all sides, and he found himself confronted with weapons aimed at the face and eyes no matter which way he turned. Like a cornered wild animal, he was ensnared in the grasp of his assailants. As each participated in the conspiracy, they took their part in the sacrificial act and tasted the bloodshed. Again, comparing this to the accustomed Ides of March sacrifice. It was, of course, eventually important that Marcus Junius Brutus take part in the assassination. Each of the assassins had to bloody their knife, and no one could be an innocent bystander. Brutus, of course, driven on by his family legacy in 509 of having expelled the last king, was further urged by the Roman people. The statues of his ancestors had been defaced with graffiti. The people had been demanding Brutus take action. And people had written on the statue of his famous namesake, the earlier Brutus, "Utinam viveras," "we wish you were still alive," right? Pleading with the Brutus of the moment to take action. So Brutus strode forward and stabbed Caesar, Suetonius tells us, in the groin. Of course, Caesar is reported in Shakespeare's play of having said a few final words to Brutus, possibly his son. Right? Shakespeare's Caesar has the famous line, "Et tu, Brute," and you, Brutus, then fall Caesar. But this is not attested in the ancient sources. This is something Shakespeare makes up. Suetonius says that his account says Caesar said nothing. He merely groaned at the first strike. But Suetonius admits that there are others who said that Caesar did say something to Brutus. Right? Brutus came and stabbed him in the groin, and the ancient sources record that it's when he saw Brutus coming forward with the knife that Caesar stopped fighting. Right? At this point, perhaps he was so overwhelmed with the emotions, or perhaps he was just exhausted from the struggle. But seeing Brutus, his beloved former friend, approaching with the knife, took the fight out of Caesar. So while Suetonius says he was silent, he does admit that others recorded that Caesar did look Brutus in the eye and say 3 final words to him, in Greek no less, kai su technon, which in English means, and you, my child, as though in this final moment acknowledging publicly his paternity. Gets a bit Freudian when you think about it, because where did Brutus stab him? In the groin, perhaps destroying then in a Freudian sense his own origins. So Caesar lay bleeding out. He was wounded either 23 or 35 times, depending on which account you take, and an autopsy was performed on his body. Ironically, only one of the wounds was fatal. He very nearly survived the onslaught. Right? These politicians were perhaps not so skilled with these daggers. It was a frenzied attack. Maybe each were hesitant, hoping someone else would deliver the final blow. 23 or 35 times he lay and bled to death on the Senate floor, ironically dying at the feet of the statue of Pompey himself, his former political partner. The assassins celebrated, but the natural world, as Virgil records, did not celebrate the moment. The natural world, the natural order, if you will, rebelled against the act. Right? Virgil records that in Germany heard the clash of weapons across the sky. The Alps were said to shake with earthquakes and spontaneously burst into flames. Great shouts were heard in the open forests, and ghosts were seen in the dark of night. Animals then spoke like humans. Rivers stopped flowing, the earth split open, and the idols in temples wept and sweated. The assailants celebrated a victory that would be short-lived. And perhaps in our next talk, we'll see what happened the very next day. That's it. Fuck off, you motherfuckers. All right, let's go get some pints.